In this video, I'm going to be talking about how to never make a mistake solving for slope. Now, solving for slope isn't a hard operation, but there's a lot of little areas where people tend to make mistakes. So we're going to use the formula y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And what we're going to do first is we're going to find the slope of this portion of the graph in orange. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and label our beginning point, which is our 1's, and our final point, which would be considered our 2's for the parts where it's y1 and x1 and y2 and x2. So this point over here, our x coordinate is 2, and our y coordinate looks like it goes up to about 80. Now what I'm going to do that most people tend to not do is I'm going to go ahead and write x1 and y1 right underneath both of them. Secondly, I'm going to grab my second point over here. It looks like it slides over 4 and it goes up to 200. And I'm also going to label this one as my x2 and then y2. Now, as I said before, the actual calculation and whole operation of finding slope isn't that complicated, but the organization of it is a part that gets some people into trouble. Now, if I'm finding the slope of this orange section, and I'm going to go ahead and rewrite the formula right over here so I could see it clearly as I put the numbers in. I'm going to go ahead and grab the numbers. Now, since I already labeled them x1 and y1 and x2 and y2, it's going to be pretty difficult to grab the wrong number value. So I'm going to grab y2, which is 200. I'm going to grab y1, which is 80. And then my x2, which is 4. And then my x1, which is 2. And then 200 minus 80 is 120. And then 4 minus 2 is 2. And all of these y values are distances in kilometers. So I'm going to go ahead and put a unit along with it too. And same for my denominator. I have 4 minus 2, which are times that are in hours. Now, if I go ahead and place those two units in there, then I won't have a problem having a unit for my final answer as well. So I have 120 divided by 2, and then I'm going to get 60 kilometers per hour as my final answer. Now, the key to solving this without making any of those little mistakes is, first of all, labeling your initial and final points and then tagging it with the x1 and the y1 and the x2 and the y2. That way, the likelihood that you're going to have an error later on in the calculation is going to be much lower. So let's go ahead and solve for this second part. And we're going to put this part in green. And if you do have a multi-section graph like this, or where there's several different slopes, what I would do is look at it one chunk at a time. So I'm going to treat this as a completely different problem. Now this is my initial position, so these are my x1s and x2s. So I already know the coordinate is 4 and 200. Now I want to make sure I label those my x1 and y1 because those are my beginning points for this last portion of the graph. If I accidentally left them as x2 and y2, then I'll get my numbers mixed up with my calculation. Now with my final data point, this one is 6 over, and it goes up to, it looks like about a distance of 50. So that's my x2 and my y2. So I'm going to do the same thing as I did with the previous one. I'm going to make sure I grab all my values. I'm going to look at my y2 minus my y1. And then I'm going to grab my x2 minus my x1. 50 minus 200 is negative 150, and that's in kilometers because those are y values. So I'm going to grab my y unit from the y-axis. And then when I do 6 minus 4, I get 2 hours. And I can go ahead and put that in my calculator. This one I could just do in my head. And I get negative 75 kilometers per hour. And the unit was easy because I already wrote down each of those 2 units before. It's always something per something because it's always the change in y over the change in x. Now, the most common mistakes that people would make is accidentally writing down some of the x coordinates as y coordinates, like maybe getting these flipped around with the 2 and the 80 and the 80 and the 2, and then also not subtracting them in the correct order, like taking a y1 minus y2. Now, if you make sure you carefully label your first and second point, write out all of your 4 values in the numerator and then in the denominator, and then include your units once you have done a little bit of subtraction or addition, then the likelihood of you making any little mistakes is going to be very low, and you're going to be successful and accurate in solving for your slopes. So I hope that's helpful to you. Thank you for watching and listening.